The modern hangar is exactly on the site of the Wartime number 2 hangar. There were 7 hangars altogether. The control tower is original, it's been redone inside from a 1943 photograph, so we know that's exactly right. This area would have been the work site of the airfield or the technical site. It would not have had on these horrible chicken huts, of course, 2008, you know. But in wartime, it would have had on control tower, briefing rooms, offices, workshops, equipment huts, maintenance stores, motor transport section, dinghy sheds, parachute stores, anything you'd need for the working of an airfield. The living accommodation was about 3/4 of a mile away in the village, so the ground crew lads had to have bikes where they cycled down here all day and every day, right throughout the whole year, whatever the weather, to service their Lancasters, which was spaced out right round the airfield in daytime, and we all know where they were at night, of course. So in August 43, 1,200 RAF people to open this airfield were suddenly plonked onto this tiny village of just 200. And you can imagine either side looking at the other and thinking, oh, I don't know about them. But as the war progressed, the RAF and the villagers became very, very friendly. When we go off in a moment, look at this grass field on your right. There's nothing to see now, but that was the site of the number 1 hangar. That one was built very close to the southern end of the village. So if you lived at the southern end of the village, when the airfield was open, you could show off and say, I've got a hangar at the bottom of my garden. But of course, having a hangar at the bottom of your garden was not a good idea. When we passed where the hangar was, look at this circle of trees, and right a bit further down, I'll explain what it was as we're passing it. Thank you, Pat.
Sounds bigger.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sounds like me in the morning.
So that was number 2 hangar site. This is number 1 hangar site. And then this circle of trees, there were just some lumps of concrete and among the trees, you may be able to see them, but it was a huge building. It was the aircrew pad. It's where the aircrew had their restroom, the dryer room, the locker room, where the aircrew got their flying harness, their helmet, their life jacket and their parachute. It was a big building, 2-storey, of course it had a boiler room and dryer room where they got all their clothes from as well. And very sadly, the building that was in among those trees was the last building that some wartime aircrew ever saw of Britain, and we all know the very sad reason why. They're modern village houses at the moment, but you can see how close they are to the airfield. They're on the site of old houses that were near the airfield. That's that one up, sorry. When Pat stops in a minute, look through a little gap between the hedge for a tiny brick building. You may not be able to see it through that little gap, tiny brick building. I'll explain what it was, you'll be thrilled to know. It's a sewage treatment works, because when the Air Force came, none of the villages round in 1943 had proper flush toilets. So you can imagine what they had to do when they emptied their toilet. But when 1,200 RAF people came, the RAF station got flush toilets, and this village alone, not any of the other villages round, this village got flush toilets. So now if you lived in this village in wartime, you could show off not only about having a hangar at the bottom of your garden, but having a new flush loo, because your cousin who lived in the next village had often run down the road cross-legged to use your new flush loo because she hadn't got a proper loo. This is the joining of 2 secondary wartime runways, only 1,400 yards long. This one has always had a runway background. Way after the war, 1954 to 58, the Americans extended it because they were going to, well, they did bring their huge B-47s. When we doubled back, we shall go up that extension American runway. But this runway, secondary runway, went straight back to agriculture after the war. We're going to stop halfway down here, and you'll wonder why on earth we've stopped.
John.
It's all right. So remember, during all the days in wartime, the Lancasters would have been parked on either side of this ferry track all round the airfield. standing on during the war for the ground crews to work on were called dispersals, frying pan shape. Very, very much bigger than that. I usually have this out when I've got children on to just show them the shape. And all the bomber airfields had the frying pan shapes, but the big airfields like this one also had loop dispersals or spectacle dispersals, where a lamp could go in at one end and then work be done, and you know, it was much better. And we know for sure that there was a huge loop dispersal about 50 yards out just over there. I nearly don't stop to tell people about this now because you can't see it, but honestly it was there. And up to about 3 years ago you could still see where the crops wouldn't grow because there's still a seepage of aviation fuel and oil and antifreeze seeping up, and of course it stops the crop growing. And I was just saying to someone in the nappy, you know, a few years ago, I don't think I'd better stop there because you can't see a thing, and I don't know whether the audience believe me. And he said, oh, do stop there because I fly a light aircraft. And he said, when I fly over there, you can definitely see where that dispersal was. So I think it is worth stopping there just to tell you. So imagine it's 1943, and you get yourself in the 1943 time warp now, and it's a freezing morning in the winter, and you ground crew and you've cycled down to this windswept dispersal to service your Lancaster. The engineer, not the pilot who flies it over at Germany at night, the daytime engineer is going to run up and check the engines, and he shouts down to you underneath the wings, you ground crew, and he shouts, clear props. It means get out of the way of the propellers because I'm going to start the engine. But you, with your head down and a screeching wind off the North Sea and your coat collar up, you don't hear him shout move, and he thinks you have heard him, and you're under the wing, you can't see him, and he starts the engine, and that starts the propeller blades. Very sadly, that's how some ground crew lost their lives during the war, by being under moving propeller blades. Or imagine your ground crew again. Do excuse me, I've got a slight allergy and it's making my nose run an awful lot. Imagine this time you're up on the engine and you've got to clean the spark plugs. And cars have 4 spark plugs, as you'll know. A Lancaster bomber has 96, and all those had got to be cleaned before you had your meal or anything. It was always, for ground crew, a question of getting those aircraft ready. Working on the aircraft all the days, and on the really snowy winters they had to sweep the snow as well. They had to sweep snow off the wings of the aircraft, off the dispersals, off the taxiway, and even off the runway. In the very bad snowy times, everybody was called out from the station, whatever their rank, except the RAF cooks and the medical men and the police, because obviously they'd got another job to do. But seriously, this is to tell you what a fabulous job wartime ground crew did and what brave men they were. When you weigh it up, those glamorous aircrew boys would never have gone anywhere at all without the efforts of their ground crews getting their aircraft ready. And we do need to remember that, so if you know any ground crews, congratulate them. Wartime airfields were huge areas of openness, just flatness and grass and concrete. This one enclosed 800 acres. When the ground crew had to come down to start servicing, they came down on their bikes to start servicing the Lanc, and of course the chains froze to the rear sprockets, so the bike wouldn't move. His laddie had got to go and fetch some screws. But the RAF always did teach you how to be resourceful, and it wasn't long before some bright young airmen had a brilliant idea how you could thaw the frozen bike chains. All the bikes were parked close together, and all the ground crew men, they were mainly men, a few women, but mainly men, that's important. This young lad said to you, you got
Don't
it,
tell me you're going to wee
you
on it.
got it, yes, it didn't matter. All the ground crew laddies went up and looked at a bike each, and they all had their hands in front of them, and they looked innocently up into the sky, and suddenly by the frozen bikes there was a lot of hot puddles and a lot of rising steam, and you can gather where the steam had come from, and it is a true story, honestly. Right, we'll go down now to the southern end of the main runway. In the excitement then I forgot to I'll pick up in a minute what it was, I forgot.
You'd have to be brave to get back.
I know the bit I forgot, I better try and get it in here. When crews come back now, they look round, and here's me telling them that yes, this was the entire airfield there, and they say, Oh, well, it seems to have shrunk. No, it hasn't shrunk at all, really. Just that when you get a bit older, everything seems to have shrunk, doesn't it? But what makes it look as if it's shrunk is because of the modern crops and trees and buildings. But it is the same size as Wartime. Upside-down concrete mushroom. That's the only Wartime thing here. I'll tell you what they are when it stops. Thank you. Hold me a minute till I'm... Yeah, thank you. So we're exactly at the southern end of the main Wartime runway. Those things, thank you so much, those things are threshold markers, or wartime light holders. That's right. They would have been along here, which was the southern end. The stalk bit of the mushroom would have been sunk into the ground, so the plate was on the top, which had a light in, and all the concrete sunk flush with the ground. So all that the pilots and navigators would have seen as they came back over the North Sea would have been a row of lights along there, flush with the ground, marking the southern end of that main runway. And apparently they worked very well, because the pilots tell me not many folk overshot, you know. Daylight, of course, when the ground crews were working on their aircraft, they'd have been parked all round the airfield. But when it was time to go at night, they'd all come down to the southern end of this main runway, get in a queue, and then they'd wait for a green light from the checkered caravan. When their secret light came, they'd belt up the runway at top speed, hoping to get off. And when this is where we used to be able to go all the way round, and we can't now. We've got to go back round there. But when we do go round, we end up being at the northern end of this main runway. And when we get up there, I'll tell you the sad story of an of an Australian piloted Lank, which did not get on. It crashed. That's the sad story there. Upon the hill behind those trees in Wartime was a windmill, owned by a family called Ely. And their daughter-in-law, when she left school in 42, she said to her dad, I don't want an office job, you know, I want to be the village dairymaid. And he said, oh, that's fine. So remember, the village did know that an airfield was going to be built. This was early 42, and there was no sign of it being built. And that very morning, Edna was driving her dad's cars to the field, and very calm, Lincolnshire village, very quiet, very calm. And suddenly, great JCBs or equivalent came belting along the road and ripped up all the gates and hedges round Edna's cows and dumped lumps of concrete, because they were going to start building the airfield there and then. And Edna said to me, Barbara, I could see surprise in my cow's eyes, you know, where's my next blade of grass? And suddenly, there was a great lump of concrete. Sounds a silly story, but it's true. It does just tell you the rapidity, the speed with which all the bomber airfields all down the eastern side of England were built very, very rapidly. There's one sentence about Lincolnshire particularly, and obviously we're in Lincolnshire. In 1943, an average of one new bomber airfield a month was built in Lincolnshire. We're not called Bomber County for nothing. So this airfield opened in 43 with just one squadron flying in, 57 Squadron, and they flew in from RAF Scampton, about 25 miles up there. Scampton's always been a well-established brick-built building, posh sort of building, and when 57 knew they were coming here, you can imagine them knocking each other and saying, we're going to open another Scampton. No, because when they got here, the airfield was only just being built. It was mud, mud, mud. Nissen huts you couldn't get the coke. Nissen huts unfinished, and coke said that you couldn't get the coke for. Oh, and did I tell you? Mud. Mud was the absolute chief thing. And the briefing room for the very first raid in August 43, you can imagine the pilot taking these other 6 lads in the briefing room and saying, listen lads, I'll tell you over here what we're going to do, and then, you know, I don't want to be telling all this over Germany. Remember that aircrew were all volunteers. You had to be 18. So a lot of them were very, very young, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 1 or 2 were even only 17 because they'd lied about their age. So you'd got the pilot telling going to tell his lads what they were going to do. He put his hand up to the electricity switch. Nothing happened. It was such a new station still being built, it was not connected to the electricity mains. So you got the pilot telling his other 6 lads, very, very young lads, all the horrors that they were going to do over Germany, and they were being told that by candlelight. I did a plug for ground crew up there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a plug for aircrew. I knew some wartime aircrew. We owe our wartime aircrews a very, very great debt of gratitude, and we should never, ever forget that. They were very, very brave men, and we wouldn't be sitting here now if it hadn't have been for them. 3 months after 57 flew in, another squadron at 630, they were the only 2 squadrons during the war, but 630 didn't fly in, they were formed of a nucleus of 57. So you got these 2 squadrons, and it meant of course that the people number went up from 1,200 to 3,000, so they'd need those proper plush loos, wouldn't they, you know. Now since we have to turn round here, I'm going to tell you all the things that we would have seen round there. That little farm, Staunch Farm, was on Airfield land. It's still a farm, but the Air Ministry let them keep it open all through the war. It's not important to us now, but that circle of trees that's just going yellowy now is important, because there was a frying pan dispersal that the Air Ministry had started to build, and they did the open bit, and when they got to the bit where the lag would have turned round at 180 degrees turn, they suddenly realised that the slipstream or prop wash would have done nothing for the people or the farm animals or you know, the tiles on the roof. So they stopped that, building that one, and it says in posh language in the station records, you know, unfinished dispersal. Well, it really means somebody sitting in London didn't know what they were doing, I think, you know. A bit further round, where those modern buildings are, no, where the second group of trees are, sad story. 17th of April 45, there was an explosion. All the Lancs were all coming off their dispersals, ready to start the raid and come down here. And one of them suddenly blew up, and of course aircraft they were all fully fueled and armed, and got all their men on already. And one of them blew up, and of course it triggered explosions in all the other Lancs as well. 2,000 gallons of high octane fuel and 8 tons of bombs were all going up in flames. And the armaments officer for the station, a Flight Lieutenant McBean, he was just cruising to the domestic site in the village for tea. He heard the noise, shot round on his motorbike and came off. But if gravel rush was his only problem on his knees, it was nothing to what he found when he got down here. All of the blazing aircraft, and young Air Force lads running around, wondering which aircraft, or more still, which of their mates they could go and rescue. And that being shouted down to all the running airmen, leave the aircraft alone, because there was such a danger of unexploded delay action bombs. So they had to stand back and watch the aircraft burn, you know, and some of their mates died, obviously. We all know one human casualty is one too many, but it's light if you weigh up what it could have been. 6 folk were killed and 14 badly injured, and oddly enough, same with the aircraft. 6 aircraft were an absolute total write-off, and 14 of those were very badly damaged as well. That's the sad story there. Where those modern buildings are now, before the war and during the early war, was Hagneby Grange Farm, owned by a family called Chatterton. It's the Chatterton family's grandson, who's the pilot today, who talked to you. Now, Mike's son John was actually born in the farmhouse there before it was Airfield, of course. And then by June 1942, Mike had joined the RAF and was learning pilot skills in America. A lot of our pilots learnt in America. And a short time after John had gone to learn piloting in America, and his mum had to write to him, and she put, we've had to move out of our old farm, John, but actually she was writing in code, so she couldn't mention Lancs or that it was Airfield. She put, we've taken our farm animals and our young fellows with us, but everything will be all right. And the new youngsters with us, they brought some black bullocks with them. They were the Lancasters, obviously. And a bit later she wrote the sad story, oh dear, some of the black bullocks have escaped or run away, we don't know what's happened to them. And the villagers are upset, but of course the lads looking after them are even more upset. Obviously that was when the Lancs crashed. Excuse me again. And when John came back, he knew exactly what you know, that she was on about, that It was the Lancs that had crashed. And when John did come back, he was a super pilot. He did a full tour with 44 Squadron, well, 31 ops actually he did. And then he was posted to another squadron, and guess what? He was posted to one of the squadrons here. Now, wartime officials, or Air Ministry officials, never liked posting their lads near their homes. I think they think they'd run in for mum's cakes or something. But John didn't, they must have lost John's address, and of course he didn't tell them. So he was actually flying over this airfield, training other young pilots. So you can imagine him saying to these young pilots, "Look, laddie, I was born in the farmhouse down there. Look, lad, you're not looking." And young pilots, youngsters as ever, RAF shoot at a line again. No, John wasn't shooting a line. He really was born in the farmhouse there. And John became a very, very great friend of mine. And kind of put this little bit in, it's personal to me, I know. But John died about 4 years ago. But obviously before that, we used to often sit on this airfield and he'd tell me a lot of these stories. That's why I know they're absolutely, authentic. But we have set a tree for him. If you stand with your back to the control tower and the windsock on your right, there's a tree set for John and 3 words on the memorial plaque underneath. It's very personal, I think. It says, "Returned home again." Now, isn't that lovely? Returned home to where he was actually born. Thank you for listening to that bit. Another sad story, a crash sort of story, because I've had to adjust my commentary a bit with doubling back. Yeah. 12th of February 44 in daylight, where the second group of trees are, a 50 Squadron aircraft, 10 folk on board, crashed. It was doing a fighter affiliation course with a Hurricane. There were 10 folk on board, but there was very suddenly a terrific fire in the Lanc, and 6 of the parachutists got down safely, but the other 4 didn't. They perished in the aircraft. That's the sad bit of that story. But the pilot of that story was a flying officer Beetham. Every time they're ploughing now, they're still turning up bits of that crash Lancs, on this old airfield. So his first visit was by parachute, this flying officer Beetham. His second visit was when he was bringing back prisoners of war on VE Day. And then 44 years after that, he'd risen right up the RAF ranks from pilot officer to be absolute top of the RAF ranks, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Michael Beetham, and he's still there, he's still alive, he's 86-ish now. And he was invited back to open our actual centre. He was invited back again to open our chapel. If you look at the plaque on the chapel door, it tells you all the letters after his name. He was invited back again to open the extension to our hangar, and then he was actually invited back again to John Chatterton's memorial service, and he came talking to me. And I was up to here with emotion that, Marshal of the Royal Air Force should come talking to me. It's because I knew John. Thank you very much for listening to that bit of the story. Thanks, Pat, lovely. So we're going to go back now and join where this track would have gone round. Wartime Runway, but extended by the Americans 54 to 58. They bought their P-47 Stratojets, but at that stage, the war they were in, and countries they wanted to defend, they couldn't sit in New York to do it, so they brought a lot of their aircraft over to Britain on SAC, Strategic Air Command. But when they got them all over here, and they lengthened that runway, and they built a huge pad, parked their aircraft in, not a hangar. But suddenly that bit of their war ended, and they took the P-47 back by road. But because they built a huge pad and extended the runway so far, they did reach a coaches. Americans called them DC-3. So 54 to 58, American coaches were here way after the war. Having American aircraft here meant that there were American servicemen in the village. Wait a tick. upside down concrete buses were, but we'll be at the northern end. Wartime runways were 50 feet wide, obviously wider than this. I don't mean runways, I mean, sorry, the taxiway was 50 feet wide, sorry. Wartime runways were 50 yards wide. So the bit we're on now is the width of a wartime runway, 50 yards. And you realise we've got onto that south-north runway. So we're nearly up at the northern end of that runway. As it goes out the trees, it'll park on the huge American path, very much post-war. British wartime taxiway route went all the way right round, the bit we had to miss, but it would have had to curve in wartime, through that gap. It stopped in a moment. It had to curve in to avoid the station bombed up, which was in that whole huge area there where the trees are. An enormous bomb dump, you can imagine. Well, you couldn't have heavily fuel-laden Lancs very near to a bomb dump, so it had to avoid that and come curving under. So the wartime taxiway is underneath this thing, because obviously this wasn't this thing. The Americans wouldn't like that, would they? They're American path, you know. That was built on top of the British runway. Now let me get this right. No, wait a minute, I'll go, just get your mind back to wartime again. Can you remember at the other end of there, I told you the sad story of a Royal Australian Air Force piloted Lang which crashed. Well, this is the exact position. He'd come belting up the runway at top speed with all the other Lancs ready to go on the raid, and even if they weren't religious, surely they'd be asking somebody somewhere, please let us get off this runway and over the North Sea. Well, sadly, that Lanc didn't. It COT crashed on takeoff just before the Spilsby Road. A very bad crash indeed. 7 folk on board, of course, being a British bomber wartime plane. And it flipped over, crashed, went upside down completely. So the undercarriage was on top. 6 of them died straight away, absolutely straight away. The rear gunner was blown off in his gun turret and lived for a few months after. But he was posted to another squadron, and he died with the other squadron. But when the rescue people went belting over to this crash Lanc, trying to rescue anybody that thought was in it, but very sadly the 6 folk were dead. But they suddenly realised that part of the aircraft had been belted off in the explosion and gone straight through the guard room roof, way over there. Where you came in, where the memorial is, that's where the guard room was. So you can imagine the length of distance, you know, that the part of the aircraft went in. And that night there was a young laddie locked in the guard room, and the rescuers said to the station padre, the vicar, "Oh goodness, vicar, there's a young lad locked in the guard room. You're the best person, he'll be dead, we sure he'll be dead, because part of the aircraft's gone through." And the station vicar went in, unlocked the door. Laddie was not dead, but he was crouched in a corner, absolutely petrified, and the station vicar said to him, apologies to any vicars, the station vicar said to him, "Well, my laddie, you know, the wrath of God will find you off wherever you may hide." And you weren't allowed to answer back in the RAF. You're still not. You could have thought of a few choice words to answer that, vicar. I know I could, but all is not lost, because a few months after that incident, a station vicar, I can't find out if it's the same one, but I think it is, a station vicar was fined 5 shillings, 25p for poaching. You can imagine young lad under his breath, sort of going, justice is done, the wrath of God will find you out. You know the story, don't you? And get your mind on a wartime evening again, we're nearly back. Wartime bomber airfields had 24 aircraft per squadron. So because this airfield had got 2 squadrons, they'd have 48 aircraft, but they were never all serviceable. The most we ever took off was 41 on a really big raid. But on an average raid, it would be about 33. So imagine a wartime evening just over here, when 33 aircraft from here were joined by those from all the bomber stations round. And Lincolnshire bomber stations were all very, very close. So joined by those from Barnsley, Conisbee, Dunholm Lodge, Fiskerton, Metheringham, Skellingthorpe, Spilsby, Waddington, Wickerby, Woodhall Spa and Scampton. All those bomber aircraft would have been gaining their own squadron height before crossing the North Sea. If they'd have gone straight out, they'd have crashed into each other. So they had to circle to get their height. And the locals tell me that on really bad nights, this section of sky was absolutely black with Lancasters. You couldn't see the moon. That was the sight. Now what about the sound? We've just heard 4 Merlins on about 40% power. Well, all the bombers going out would have been on full power, and there would have been 1,200 Merlin engines. So the locals tell me that on really bad nights, they never even went to bed. They knew they wouldn't sleep. They just lolled about in an armchair and counted our lads going up from this station and the aircraft going up. And when 3 o'clock in the morning, when the bombers were all landing, they'd count the bombers landing back here, and if the number landing was less than the number that went up, they and we know the very sad story of what had happened to them. It was extremely sad if you lived as close to an airfield as this village did. What else I've got to just tell you? Oh yeah, that area there was the wartime technical, and a bit further, was the wartime technical site, which would have had on, I always forget this bit because it's a woman, men remember it. Oh, I know, the motor transport section. And one morning, very near the end of the war, March 4th, 45, a Yonkers 88, an enemy aircraft, an intruder, came in with our Lancs as they were landing. And our control tower realised he was there, switched the lights off, and miraculously all our Lancs landed safely, because the Yonkers didn't know where he was then, and he strafed everything that he thought was still airfield with cannon and machine gun fire. And there were 4 close together hangars where those mod hangar shapes are, and we can't go round that way now, but they were the other 4 which made up the 7 altogether. And he strafed all of that. He missed the base hangar, so, but he's followed through Solomon, straight over and hit in the village, hit the officers where the debriefing section, where WAFs, Lady Airmen, Women's Auxiliary Air Force ladies, were getting the debriefing ready, and 5 of those WAFs were very badly injured and 1 died later. So wartime WAFs, ladies on airfields, did take casualties as well as the men. And I end up with these 2 stories. One is a reminder, the very first Lancaster to enter East Kirkby flew in from Scampton, way over there with all her mates of course, to Oakland the airfield in August 27, 1943. And the very last Lancaster to enter East Kirkby, she also came in, yes Pat, thank you, also came in from Scampton, but she didn't fly in. She'd been gate guard at Scampton for a long time, as Mike told me when we were the briefing. And by 1988, our brothers had bought her and they wanted to bring her here. So Scampton engineer dismantled her and bought that Lancaster here in parts under our latest vehicles, and they came with her, and with the skill of the Scampton engineers and the skill of our engineers and the dedication of volunteers, all the parts of that Scampton gate guard in 1988 joined together to form our glorious all the parts, I'll say it again, all the parts of the Scampton gate guard joined together to form our glorious MX611, and here's cheers. And if we love her, and of course if you didn't either love her or know her before you heard her story and the story of all her sisters, we hope that you will love her as much as we do. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope that by loving her you will remember all the brave lads, ground and air crew, who worked on or flew such fabulous aircraft as this one. Thank you very, very much. The owners always say to me, Guess what? It's about like a minute past 12, isn't it? If you corporate people rush into the nappy now for your lunch at the far end of the nappy,
It was served well. It was
yeah,
so cool.
there's food at the other end of the nappy for the non-corporate.